The Clock is the first episode of the Doris Day Show that I haven't completely loved. That's not to say I didn't like it, I really thoroughly enjoyed it. But it didn't leave me with the same fuzzy, warm feeling that they usually do. And I'm trying to evaluate why that is, because the narrative was interesting, all of the main characters were there. We also had several additional characters as well. And I think if I had to put my finger on why it was, I think it's because Doris Martin was not her usual self. She was exhausted, and I will explain why in a moment. But I think that's maybe why. But I'm not so sure. If you feel the same way as I do, please feel free to share why you think that is. But Doris is given a clock by LeRoy. And Doris is already very exhausted. She's got to come up with this report to present to a group. She's already very tired, losing a lot of sleep. And LeRoy buys her this clock that she's in love with. It's a chiming clock. She's always wanted one. But it didn't occur to her that it would chime on the hour, every hour. And she goes to bed and it keeps chiming and it keeps waking her up. But she doesn't want to get rid of it because she loves it. But her father, Buck, sees that this is making Doris even more exhausted and really making her quite unwell, so he decides to take things into his own hands. And what follows is a little bit of an adventure for the clock. The clock definitely goes on an interesting journey. And it's interesting enough. I was curious to see where the clock would end up, how it would resolve itself, and indeed whether or not Doris would get sufficient sleep. But there was nothing in it that was as homely or as cosy and warm that we usually get with Doris Day Show. And that's a bit of a shame. But as I said, it's not a terrible episode. It's really enjoyable. It's really good. The narrative developed well. Buck's concern for Doris's welfare, of course, her being his daughter, was something that was beautiful to see. The boys were in it a little bit, Billy and Toby. I find that they often bring a lot of the amusement and a lot of the joy. They weren't in it as much as I would have liked. I think there were maybe a few too many additional characters as well. There were about 6 or 7, maybe more, women in the room when Doris was giving this report, and most of them we didn't even get to hear from. Which is not a problem, but again, with the Doris Day Show, usually it's very close-knit. We don't have that many outside characters, and there were a couple of others as well. And I think it felt very different. Not bad, but comparably not as good. Obviously, I would recommend it. I would watch it again. But The Clock is, needless to say, not my favourite episode of the Doris Day Show.